The worst mistake I ever made was not sleeping with a stranger during an unexpected heat. It was sending her the ultrasound 4 months later. I thought my life was already about as bad as it could get before that Tuesday. I had exactly $140 in my checking account, a landlord who considered, eventually, an acceptable timeline for fixing a broken radiator, and a body that had recently started doing things without consulting me first. Then my phone buzzed on the break room table, and the universe decided to prove, in the most efficient way possible, that it had a personal grudge against me specifically, and had apparently been saving it up for this exact moment. I want to be clear, before this goes any further, that I am not usually a reckless person. I balance my budget in a spreadsheet with color-coded tabs. I triple-check every email before I send it. I am, by every reasonable measure, a woman who takes precautions. And yet here we are, because precautions, it turns out, mean absolutely nothing against a rainy night, an off-cycle heat, and a woman who apparently rearranges rooms just by standing in the doorway of them. Part 1, the wrong text. I was sick at my desk again. Not the polite, manageable kind of sick you can push through with a peppermint candy and sheer willpower. The kind that arrives at 10 in the morning like an eviction notice and doesn't care that a report is due at noon, that your manager is already unimpressed with you, that you have exactly one bathroom break left in your dignity before people start asking questions. I had been keeping the secret for 6 weeks. 6 weeks of loose blouses and skipped lunches and lying to Jamie about just a stomach bug, with the specific, guilty conviction of someone who knows a stomach bug does not usually last a month and a half. 6 weeks of standing in front of my bathroom mirror at midnight, turning sideways, trying to convince myself the changes weren't visible yet, that I still had time to figure out a plan before anyone else had to know. Dr. Alian's office texted the ultrasound to my phone that morning with a cheerful little message attached. Here's your 12-week photo. Congratulations again, Myra. Like this was a normal thing happening to a normal person with a normal, functioning support system and a savings account that wasn't held together by hope, denial, and a truly unreasonable number of instant ramen packets. I stared at the grainy little photo for a long time. A shape, a future, a person apparently who already had elbows, according to the doctor's careful pen circling one corner of the image. Elbows. I hadn't been ready for elbows. Somehow the idea of a heartbeat had felt abstract enough to manage, but elbows made it real in a way that made my own arms feel strange and unfamiliar, like I was suddenly responsible for someone else's entire skeleton. I wanted Jamie to see it first. Jamie, who had sat cross-legged on a gas station bathroom floor with me while I cried over 2 blue lines 4 months earlier, who had bought me ginger ale and said nothing except, "Okay, so what do we do now?" Using we like it was already decided she wasn't going anywhere regardless of what my answer turned out to be. Jamie deserved to be the first person who saw proof that the thing we'd been quietly panicking about together for months was real, was growing, had a heartbeat now instead of just a number on a plastic test strip. My hands were shaking. They had been shaking on and off for 6 weeks, a low, persistent tremor that lived somewhere between hormones and terror, and showed no signs of scheduling a departure anytime soon. I had started to think of it as background noise, the same way you eventually stop noticing traffic outside your window. I typed J into the contact search, saw a name populate, and hit send without checking that the number underneath actually matched the name I thought I'd selected. My thumb was faster than my caution that day, the way it had been faster than my caution on a rainy night 4 months earlier, and I would come to understand, much later, that my thumb had apparently developed better instincts than the rest of me combined. The reply came back in under a minute. Not from Jamie. From a number I did not recognize, formatted with an area code I'd never seen attached to anyone in my contacts, in a tone so clipped and precise it felt less typed than engraved into stone somewhere far above my pay grade. Whose child is this? I stared at those 3 words until the office fluorescents overhead started to hum louder than they should have, until the report on my screen blurred into meaningless gray rectangles, until my heartbeat relocated itself somewhere up near my ears and stayed there. I typed 4 different responses. Sorry, wrong number. Deleted it too casual, like I hadn't just handed a total stranger the single most vulnerable photo of my entire life. This was meant for someone else, please disregard. Deleted it too formal, like I was drafting a corporate memo instead of apologizing for an accidental confession that had apparently reached exactly the wrong inbox. Please don't ask me that. Deleted it too, because it was, somehow, the most honest of the four, and honesty was the last thing I could afford to hand a stranger who already knew more about my current life circumstances than my own mother did. I settled, in the end, for the coward's option, the one available to anyone with a smartphone and a deep, unexamined unwillingness to face consequences directly. I blocked the number, because apparently I believed panic was a legal strategy. I told myself for the rest of that day that it was fine. Wrong numbers happen constantly, to normal people, all the time. Somewhere out there, some perfectly ordinary stranger was probably staring at my daughter's first photograph in mild, forgettable confusion, shrugging and deleting it, moving on with an evening that had absolutely nothing to do with me or my increasingly complicated life. People did not chase down accidental pregnancy photos sent by strangers. That was not a thing that happened in real life. That was the kind of plot twist that belonged in exactly the sort of dramatic story I would have rolled my eyes at a year earlier, back when my biggest problem was whether I could afford both my electric bill and groceries in the same week. I told myself all of that, walking home in the fading afternoon light, past the corner bodega where I could no longer afford my usual coffee, past the bus stop where I usually people-watched to distract myself from how tired I was. I nearly believed it entirely by the time I climbed into my bed that night. My studio apartment with its permanently broken radiator, its window that didn't quite close all the way even in December, its rent that ate 60% of a paycheck I could not afford to lose under any circumstances, and lay there with one hand resting on the very slight, very new curve beneath my ribs, doing the math I had been very deliberately avoiding for 6 full weeks. 12 weeks pregnant, which meant conception had happened almost exactly the night I had spent the last 4 months trying, and consistently failing, to forget entirely. Part 2, the night I ran from her. It had rained that night. Not the gentle, atmospheric kind of rain that makes a city look wistful in a movie trailer, but the real kind. The kind that soaks through a jacket in 90 seconds, turns every sidewalk into a slick hazard, and somehow, against all logic, still manages to make bad decisions feel less like bad decisions and more like fate wearing better lighting than it deserved. Jamie had insisted I needed one night that wasn't about rent, or overtime, or the low, grinding exhaustion of being 24 and broke in a city that charged premium rates for the privilege of merely surviving in it. One night, she'd said, dragging me by the wrist toward a club neither of us could really afford the cover charge for, her own rent situation not appreciably better than mine. One night where your biggest problem is deciding what to drink, and not whether you can afford to drink it. I had argued, initially. I had a report due Monday, a budget that did not accommodate cover charges or overpriced cocktails, and a general aversion to crowded rooms that had only gotten worse the more exhausted I became from working 2 jobs to cover a rent increase my landlord had sprung on me with exactly 30 days' notice. Jamie had overridden every objection with the specific stubbornness of a best friend who has decided, correctly as it turned out, that you need saving from yourself more than you need to be listened to that particular week. "You've canceled on me 4 times this month," she said, already pulling a dress out of my closet that I'd forgotten I owned. "I am not asking. We are going. You can be miserable about your finances again starting Monday." I had gone, grumbling the entire cab ride over, my heat not due for another 2 weeks according to the app I tracked it with, feeling entirely confident that the evening would consist of nothing more dramatic than overpriced drinks and tired feet by midnight. I had not gone looking for anything more complicated than a distraction from my own life. I had certainly not gone in expecting an unscheduled, off-cycle heat to hit me on the dance floor with roughly the warning of a car crash. No build-up, no gradual onset, just an abrupt, full-body wall of need that had absolutely nothing to do with my carefully tracked calendar and everything to do with catastrophically terrible timing. I remember the precise moment the room changed. Not because the music shifted or the lighting dimmed, but because a woman walked through the entrance and the air itself seemed to reorganize around her presence, the way water reorganizes itself around something dropped into it, ripples moving outward from a single point of impact. She did not enter the room. The room rearranged itself around her. She was tall in a way that made the doorway look almost too small for the authority she carried through it without effort. Alpha, unmistakably. The kind of presence that didn't announce itself so much as simply exist, loudly, without needing volume to do it. Conversations near the entrance quieted by half a decibel without anyone consciously deciding to lower their voices. The way a restaurant goes quiet when someone important walks in, and nobody can quite say why. My heat hit its full, undeniable peak roughly 90 seconds after she crossed into my line of sight, and I have never been fully convinced, in the month since, that those two facts were entirely unrelated. Jamie, beside me, said something I didn't hear at all, because by that point my entire nervous system had narrowed its focus down to a single point of interest across a crowded room, and Jamie, watching my face change, simply sighed and said, "Oh no, okay. Go do whatever you're about to do. I'll get us a cab home. Text me you're alive." I don't remember deciding to approach her. I remember her scent finding me first, something low and warm and faintly like the smell of rain on hot pavement, the kind of scent that made every carefully trained instinct I'd spent years disciplining into submission simply surrender the argument without so much as a fight. My brain said run. My body said alpha. My rent said absolutely not. We cannot afford whatever this is about to cost us emotionally or otherwise. My rent, it turned out, did not get a vote that particular evening, no matter how loudly it protested from somewhere in the back of my mind. What happened after that I will keep mostly to myself, because some nights belong only to the two people who lived through them, and I have never been able to fully translate it into language that does it justice without either sounding clinical or sounding like something out of a magazine I'd be embarrassed to admit I'd read cover to cover more than once. I will say only this. It was the first time in years I had felt entirely, dangerously safe in someone else's hands, safe in a way that had nothing to do with locks or security deposits or emergency contacts, and everything to do with the specific quality of attention she gave me, like I was the only variable in the entire room worth solving for that night. It terrified me more than anything reckless ever should have, and it kept terrifying me for 4 months after, in the quiet moments when I let myself remember it too clearly. I woke at dawn to an empty bed, gray early light coming through curtains I didn't recognize in an apartment far nicer than any I'd ever set foot in, a note that wasn't there, and a single black business card resting on the nightstand, blank, except for a single embossed initial I didn't recognize, and a phone number I had absolutely no intention of ever calling. I told myself she had only wanted me for the heat. That was what alphas did. Everyone said so. Every cautionary story I'd ever half listened to at family gatherings said so. Every article Jamie had ever sent me with a warning emoji attached said so. I dressed in that gray, unflattering light, my hands shaking for reasons that had nothing to do with the cold, and on my way out the door I tore the card in half, then quarters. Then I dropped the pieces into a trash can 3 blocks away, as though physical distance from a scrap of paper could somehow put distance between me and the memory of the person it represented. I did not read the name on the card. I destroyed it before I could learn exactly who I was running from, because some part of me suspected that knowing her name would make it that much harder to keep pretending the whole night had simply been a fluke, a mistake, a story I could eventually stop telling myself. Part 3, the clinic door opened. 4 months later, on an entirely ordinary Thursday afternoon, I sat in Dr. Alian's waiting room holding a parenting magazine I was not actually reading, waiting for my name to be called for the appointment where I would, for the first time, hear my daughter's heartbeat out loud instead of just seeing its flickering evidence on a screen. I was rehearsing, in my head, the questions I wanted to ask. Whether the nausea was supposed to still be this bad at 16 weeks. Whether the strange, specific cravings for pickles and orange juice mixed together meant something was wrong with me nutritionally, or just wrong with me generally, in the way I'd apparently always suspected. Whether it was normal to still be this afraid, this far along, of a future I had absolutely no financial plan for beyond a vague hope that things would somehow work out the way they always somehow, barely, worked out. I had come alone, as I had to every appointment so far, because Jamie's shifts rarely aligned with mine, and because I hadn't told my own family yet, not properly, not in a way that invited them to sit with me in waiting rooms and ask questions about due dates. I had gotten used to being alone in rooms like this one, flipping through magazines about other people's normal, uncomplicated pregnancies, doing math in my head about hospital bills and maternity leave. I wasn't sure my employer would even grant me given how new I still was there. I had also, if I am being fully honest, spent an embarrassing amount of that morning thinking about the woman from the club, the way I did most mornings by then, though I had gotten better at shoving the thought aside before it could fully form. I told myself it was hormones. I told myself it was simply the specific vulnerability of being pregnant and unpartnered that made me occasionally wonder, uselessly, who the other half of this baby's genetics belonged to beyond a scent I could still recall too vividly for comfort. I was not thinking about her specifically in that exact moment, waiting for my name to be called, which perhaps made what happened next feel even more like the universe interrupting a sentence I hadn't finished forming. The door to the waiting room opened, and the temperature of the entire room seemed to drop 3 degrees at once, the way it does right before a storm breaks somewhere close by. I looked up expecting a nurse calling a name. I found, instead, the alpha from that rain-soaked night 4 months earlier, standing in the doorway in a tailored charcoal coat that probably cost more than my entire year's rent combined, her expression carved from something far colder and more controlled than the version of her I remembered from that club. Though the scent beneath the control was unmistakably, impossibly, exactly the same, and my body recognized it half a second before my mind caught up to what was happening. "Serafina Vale," she said, by way of introduction, though every cell in my body had already recognized her a full second before my mind caught up to the name being attached to a face I had spent 4 months trying, and failing, to forget entirely. I had heard that name before. Everyone in this city had heard that name before, whether they wanted to or not. Vale Holdings owned half the skyline visible from my own cracked apartment window, and the other half, I suspected, simply hadn't gotten around to buying yet. I had spent one reckless, rain-soaked night with a woman who turned out to be, by any reasonable measure, one of the most powerful alphas in the entire country, and I had spent every single day since running as hard as I could from the one clue that might have told me exactly who I'd been running from. "You sent me our child's first picture," Serafina said, each word deliberate, measured, landing like a verdict already decided long before she'd arrived. "And then you blocked me." The room tilted, just slightly, the way rooms do right before you're about to say something you can't take back. That was you. The wrong number, that was actually. "Was not wrong," she said. "I have carried that number since the night I met you, hoping, every single day since, that you would use it before I was forced to use it to find you myself instead." I stood up too quickly, my magazine sliding off my lap and onto the waiting room floor with a soft slap, my hand rising instinctively to press flat against my own stomach, as though I could somehow shield her from a truth I hadn't even finished processing myself, let alone prepared to share with the woman standing in front of me. "The baby is mine," I said, my voice coming out sharper and more frightened than I intended it to. "Just mine." "I am not here to argue that point today," Serafina said, and something beneath the composure in her voice sounded, for just a moment, almost tired in a way I hadn't expected from someone who looked this thoroughly in control of every square inch of the room around her. "I am here because your ultrasound was intercepted by a security filter my family maintains, one designed specifically to flag anything connected to our bloodline registry. That means people considerably less careful than I am now know that you exist, and that you are carrying a child connected to my family. I am not here to take anything from you, Miss Chen. I am here because you are standing in more danger than you currently understand, and I would rather you be angry with me for saying so than unprotected because I didn't. That was the moment I realized the wrong number had never been wrong at all. It had, in its own strange, backwards way, found exactly the person it was always going to find. Part 4, the first ultrasound together. Dr. Alian, to her enormous credit, did not so much as blink when Serafina Vale followed me into the exam room without invitation and settled into the chair beside the table, as though she had been assigned it in advance by someone with considerably more authority than either of us possessed. "Is this the other mother?" Dr. Alian asked, gesturing between us with the easy, practiced neutrality of someone who had clearly seen every possible configuration of family walk through that particular door over the years of her career. "No," I said, far too quickly, my voice cracking slightly on the single syllable. "Yes," Serafina said, at precisely the same moment, and did not offer any correction to soften the contradiction hanging awkwardly between us. I let it go, mostly because the sonogram wand was already cold against my stomach, and I did not have the emotional bandwidth remaining to sort out labels in front of a stranger in scrubs holding equipment against my bare skin. Within seconds, the small room filled with a sound I had been waiting 16 weeks to hear. Fast, insistent, unmistakably alive. A rhythm entirely separate from my own heartbeat that made the whole abstract idea of baby collapse suddenly into something painfully, wonderfully real in a way no test strip or grainy photo had managed before. "There she is," Dr. Alian said, turning the monitor so both of us could see the small, flickering shape on the screen, limbs distinct now in a way they hadn't been at 12 weeks, a tiny hand visible near what might have been a face. Strong heartbeat, everything measuring exactly on schedule. I watched Serafina's face while she watched that screen, and for the first time since she had walked back into my life, the careful architecture of her composure genuinely, visibly cracked, just at the edges, just enough for me to see it happen. The Alpha Queen looked at the screen like the world had finally given her something she could not buy. "She's real," Serafina said quietly, more to herself, I think, than to either of us actually present in the room with her. "She," I repeated, catching the pronoun immediately. "You've already decided that." "I decided the moment I saw the photograph you sent by accident," Serafina said, not looking away from the monitor for even a second. "I have spent 4 months imagining her. I confess I did not expect, until this exact second, to be entirely correct about the fact that she was real at all, and not simply something I had convinced myself of out of desperation, I suppose, is the honest word for what I've been feeling, though I am not accustomed to using it about myself." Dr. Alian, with the tact of someone who had clearly learned exactly when a room needed privacy, found something urgent to check on her tablet and gave the two of us a minute neither of us had explicitly asked for, but that both of us, clearly, badly needed in that moment. I did not cry. I want that on the record for whatever it's worth. But it was close enough that I had to look very deliberately at the ceiling tiles for several seconds before trusting my own composure again. "Would you like to know anything else about today's measurements before we finish up?" Dr. Alian asked eventually, returning with the specific brisk kindness doctors develop after years of witnessing exactly this kind of moment. "Everything," Serafina said before I could answer. Then, catching herself, glancing at me with something almost like an apology, if that's permitted, if Myra is comfortable with that. I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I was. Dr. Alian walked us through growth percentiles, through the measurements of a spine that was, apparently, developing exactly on schedule, through the small technical details that meant nothing to me emotionally and everything to me practically. Serafina asked questions I hadn't thought to ask myself, about my iron levels, about whether stress hormones could cross into fetal development, about whether the specific danger she now knew I was in constituted a medical risk on top of an obvious personal one. Dr. Alian answered each question with the patient thoroughness of someone used to nervous fathers, though she was careful, I noticed, never to assign Serafina that specific label out loud, leaving the shape of our relationship undefined and unpressured for now. You ask a lot of questions for someone who claims not to know anything about pregnancy, I said afterward, in the elevator down to the parking garage, mostly to fill the silence that had settled between us. I have spent the last 4 months reading everything I could find, Serafina admitted, a faint, uncharacteristic flush rising along her jaw. I did not know if I would ever find you again. I wanted to be useful regardless, in case some version of this moment ever actually arrived. I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing at all, and we rode the rest of the way down in a silence that felt, for the first time since she'd walked through that waiting room door, less like tension and more like the early, tentative outline of something neither of us had a name for yet. Part 5, the street collapse. I left that appointment more shaken than I had walked in, my legs unsteady beneath me, my mind doing the specific, frantic math of a woman who had just watched the most powerful person she'd ever met stare at an ultrasound like it was the answer to a question she'd been asking her entire life without ever expecting a response. I did what I always did when the ground felt unstable underneath me. I ran. Not literally. My legs weren't entirely built for that anymore, not 16 weeks in, my balance already shifting in unfamiliar ways. But I walked fast, faster than was strictly comfortable, out of the clinic and down the block, my breath coming quick and shallow, my thoughts a chaotic tangle of she can't have her. She can't just walk in and have her. I don't even know this woman. I know exactly what this woman feels like at 2 a.m. and nothing else about her at all, nothing real. Nothing that would hold up if this all went wrong. I made it 3 blocks before my body, already exhausted from months of stress compounded by the shock of that morning, decided it had had quite enough of my decision-making process entirely and intended to lodge a formal, physical complaint. Myra, her voice behind me, closer than I expected, because of course she had followed. Of course a woman who owned half the skyline did not simply let a pregnant stranger walk away from her into busy traffic without comment or concern. I don't need you to. I never finished that sentence. The sidewalk tilted in a way sidewalks are not supposed to tilt, the gray afternoon light narrowing at the edges like a camera aperture slowly closing. And the last coherent thought I had before everything went soft and distant was an irrational, furious certainty that I absolutely refused to faint in front of this particular woman. Of all the people in this city I could have fainted in front of. I never hit the ground. The woman I was running from caught me like she had been waiting 4 months to do exactly that, one arm sliding beneath my knees, the other bracing firm and sure against my back, lifting me entirely off my feet with an ease that made the whole street blur past in strange, tilted fragments of color and motion. I have you, she said, low and urgent, every trace of boardroom composure gone entirely from her voice, replaced by something raw and frightened that I hadn't yet heard from her. I have you. Stay with me. You are not doing this alone anymore, whether you intend to argue with me about it later or not. Do you understand me? Stay with me, Myra. I wanted to argue. Somewhere between the fainting and the strange, unwilling safety of being carried through a crowd of concerned strangers, I found I no longer had the strength left to. Part 6, the Golden K. I woke in the back of a car with seats softer than my own mattress, an IV of electrolytes already taped gently into my arm by a private physician Serafina had apparently summoned before I'd even finished losing consciousness on the sidewalk. My head ached dully. My pride ached considerably worse. You fainted from a combination of stress, dehydration, and low blood sugar, the physician said, checking my pulse with the brisk efficiency of someone paid extraordinarily well to be brisk and efficient about exactly this kind of situation. Nothing acutely dangerous today, but at 16 weeks, you cannot afford repeat episodes like this one. Your body is already working harder than you're giving it credit for. You are staying with me, Serafina said, from the seat across from me, her hands folded tightly in her lap in a way that suggested restraint rather than calm. Until we understand exactly how much danger you are currently in, and until I am confident you are eating and resting the way this pregnancy actually requires. That wasn't a question, I said, my voice still thin and unsteady from the whole ordeal. No, she agreed, entirely without apology in her tone. It wasn't, and I don't intend to pretend otherwise. My apartment had a broken radiator that had been getting fixed eventually, for 4 months running, a landlord who screened my calls, and a downstairs neighbor who played music loud enough to rattle my dishes at inconvenient hours. Her car had heated seats arranged in a configuration my entire studio apartment's monthly electric bill could not have covered, and a quiet that felt less like luxury and more like the absence of every problem I'd been carrying alone for months. The penthouse, when we finally arrived, looked less like an apartment and more like the kind of place featured in magazines. I'd never once been able to afford the subscription for floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a skyline I'd only ever seen from street level. A kitchen larger than my entire current living space. Art on the walls that looked like it belonged in a museum rather than someone's private home. A nursery, partially furnished already, sat behind a door I hadn't asked to be shown, and its existence told me, more clearly than anything Serafina could have said aloud, exactly how long she had been quietly preparing for a reality I had only just started to accept myself, weeks after she apparently already had. "This is kidnapping," I said, standing in the middle of that enormous, gleaming living room, arms crossed protectively over my stomach. "This is protection," Serafina said, patient in a way that somehow made me angrier rather than calmer, the particular patience of someone who has clearly rehearsed this exact conversation in her head multiple times already. "I understand you cannot yet tell the difference between the two. I am hoping, given time, that you will come to see it differently, though I recognize I cannot force that understanding no matter how much I might want to." Her penthouse looked like a palace. That was the problem. Palaces were still cages if you could not choose the door yourself, no matter how comfortable the furniture inside happened to be. The first few nights were the hardest. I lay awake in a guest room larger than my entire old apartment, staring at a ceiling I didn't recognize, listening to the unfamiliar quiet of a building with walls thick enough that I couldn't hear traffic, couldn't hear my old downstairs neighbor's music, couldn't hear anything at all except my own heartbeat, and the occasional, distant sound of Serafina moving somewhere else in the apartment, apparently just as unable to sleep as I was. On the third night, unable to stand the silence any longer, I wandered out to the kitchen for water and found her at the counter, still in her work clothes despite the late hour, a single glass of untouched wine in front of her, staring at nothing in particular. "Can't sleep either?" I asked. "I am not accustomed to sharing my space with anyone," she admitted, which was, I would come to learn, about as close to vulnerability as Serafina Vale allowed herself in those early days. "I find I am listening for you, making sure you are still here. It is an unfamiliar sensation." "You could just ask if I'm planning on running again," I said, half joking, though the question landed heavier than I intended it to. "Are you?" she asked, and there was something genuinely uncertain in her voice, something that didn't match the woman who had torn a custody contract in half in front of 30 shareholders months later. I thought about it honestly, standing there in a stranger's kitchen with a life growing inside me that neither of us had planned for. "Not tonight," I said, which was the most honest answer I had to give her at the time, and something in her shoulders visibly loosened at hearing it, as though she'd been bracing for a different answer entirely. Part 7, Protection Through Action. What surprised me, over the weeks that followed, was not the wealth itself, though it was, admittedly, hard to entirely ignore an ice sculpture's worth of marble countertop every single morning, or the housekeeper who somehow always knew exactly when I needed more water without being asked. It was the specific, quiet attentiveness underneath it all, the way Serafina Vale, a woman who apparently ran an empire with nothing more than a single raised eyebrow, seemed to have redirected an entire fraction of that same relentless focus onto the smallest, least glamorous details of my daily survival. Ginger tea appeared beside my bed each morning at the exact hour my nausea reliably peaked, steeped precisely the way I'd once mentioned, offhand, months earlier, that my grandmother used to make it before she passed away. I hadn't even remembered telling her that detail until the third morning it appeared, exactly right, and I'd had to sit very still for a moment processing the fact that she'd been listening that closely to something I'd said in passing during our very first, tense conversation. Prenatal vitamins were laid out beside a full glass of water before I even remembered, most mornings, that I needed to take them. A quiet, discreet security detail, present enough to matter, invisible enough that I rarely consciously noticed them going about their work, kept a perimeter around every place I went, careful never to feel like the cage I'd first accused the whole arrangement of being, even though logically, I knew, it still technically was one, however gently constructed. Serafina attended every single appointment Dr. Elian scheduled, without exception, without me ever once having to ask her to come, sitting through discussions of iron levels and folic acid and birthing plans with the same undivided attention. She apparently gave hostile corporate takeovers according to the business articles Jamie occasionally sent me with unnecessary commentary attached. And more than once, late at night, needing the bathroom, I opened my bedroom door to find her asleep in the hallway chair positioned just outside it, not close enough to intrude on my space, just close enough to hear me immediately if I called out for any reason at all. "You don't have to do all of this," I told her one particular morning, finding her already dressed and pouring the tea before I'd even fully surfaced from sleep, her hair still slightly damp from an early shower. "I know," she said simply, without looking up from the kettle. "I am not doing it because I have to. I am doing it because I want to, and because I did not have the chance to do any of it for the first 4 months, and I find I am somewhat determined to make up for lost time." She never once demanded my trust outright, never framed any of it as a transaction requiring gratitude in return for services rendered. She simply kept showing up, morning after morning, small deliberate detail after small deliberate detail, until my fear slowly, grudgingly began running out of arguments to make against her. She did not ask me to trust her. She kept showing up until my fear ran out of arguments. There were harder nights, too. Nights I won't pretend away for the sake of a tidy story arc. Nights I screamed at her that I hadn't asked for any of this, that I didn't want to owe a stranger's fortune anything, that being taken care of by someone who could simply buy her way through any problem felt like being handled rather than loved, like a project rather than a person. Serafina never once raised her voice back at me during those nights. She would simply say, quietly, standing in the doorway with her hands loose at her sides, "You are allowed to be furious with me. I am not going anywhere regardless of how angry you are tonight." And then she would leave the room to give me the space I clearly needed, and the tea would still be there the next morning anyway, exactly on time, as if the fight had never happened at all, though I could tell, from the tired shadows under her eyes some mornings, that it had cost her something to leave rather than argue back. I learned, slowly, that this was simply how she loved, not through grand declarations, at least not at first, but through the accumulation of small, unglamorous acts that never once demanded acknowledgement in return. There was a particular Tuesday, around the 20-week mark, when a craving hit me so specifically, and so suddenly that I nearly cried from the sheer inconvenience of it. A particular brand of spiced mango candy sold only at a specific corner store near my old apartment, the kind of thing that had comforted me through every hard month of my childhood, discontinued, as far as I knew, for at least a year. I mentioned it once, in passing, mostly complaining, not expecting anything to come of it. 3 days later, a small, unmarked box appeared on the kitchen counter, containing exactly 11 bags of that exact candy, tracked down, I later learned, through a supplier in another state after the local distributor confirmed it no longer carried the brand. "You didn't have to do that," I said, staring at the box like it might vanish if I looked away. "I know," Serafina said, not looking up from her tablet, in the exact tone she always used for that particular phrase, the one that had become, without either of us naming it as such, something like a private joke between us by then. "Say it anyway," I told her. She looked up, something warm flickering behind the composure. I wanted to. It became, over those weeks, a kind of ritual, me complaining about some small, specific want, half joking, never actually expecting anything, and Serafina, days later, quietly producing exactly that thing without comment, as though she had simply been waiting for an excuse to spend an entire afternoon solving a problem that most people would never have considered worth solving at all. Part 8, The Family Threat. The danger became fully concrete on a rainy Thursday, an appropriately cruel kind of rain. I remember thinking, given how thoroughly rain had already ruined my life once before this. When Serafina came home earlier than her usual hour, her expression harder and more controlled than I had seen it since that first afternoon in the clinic waiting room. "The pregnancy has leaked into the Vale family registry," she said, without any preamble at all, setting her coat down on the entryway table with more force than the gesture strictly required. "My cousin Dorian has already begun making calls, and I suspect he has been preparing this move for considerably longer than I would like to admit having missed." "What does that actually mean?" I asked, my hand instinctively finding my stomach. In terms that don't sound like a corporate briefing, I don't have the security clearance to understand. "It means," Serafina said, each word deliberate, controlled, furious beneath that control, "that my family does not see you as a person carrying a child of her own, built from love or attraction or whatever this has become between us. They see a Vale bloodline heir, conceived outside any sanctioned family arrangement, and they will move to claim custody the very moment they believe they have legal standing to attempt it. Dorian, specifically, has wanted control over this family's future for years, and an unclaimed heir represents, to him, an opportunity rather than a child." I felt something cold settle low in my stomach that had nothing to do with the pregnancy itself. "They want to take her." "They want the bloodline," Serafina said. "I want the child to breathe safely and to grow up knowing she is loved rather than owned by a company. Those are not remotely the same goal, and I intend to make certain everyone in my family understands the difference before this matter is finished, whatever it costs me personally to make that point clear to them." "Tell me about him," I said. "Dorian, I want to understand what we're actually dealing with, not just the shape of the threat." Serafina sat down across from me, rubbing her temple in a rare moment of visible fatigue. "Dorian is my late father's nephew. He has believed, for as long as I can remember, that the company should have passed to the male line of the family rather than to me, despite the fact that I have run it more profitably in a decade than my father managed in 3. He has spent years quietly building alliances on the council, waiting for any opportunity to argue that my judgment is compromised. An unclaimed heir, born outside a sanctioned arrangement, is precisely the kind of opportunity he has been waiting for. So this isn't really about the baby at all," I said slowly. "It's about him wanting your company." "It has never been about the baby to him," Serafina said, "which is, in some ways, more dangerous than if it were. A man who wants a child is at least predictable. A man who wants leverage will use whatever tool presents itself, and right now, that tool is you, and by extension, her." Part 9, Emotional Confession. The fear made me cruel, the way fear sometimes does when it has nowhere productive left to go. And I turned it, unfairly, on the one person in that entire penthouse actually trying to help me through all of this. "Is that all this ever was?" I said, my voice rising before I could stop it. "Protecting your bloodline's investment. Is that why you found me at all, not because you cared about me as a person, but because some registry flagged a Vale asset growing inside a stranger's body, and you decided to manage the liability?" Something in Serafina's expression went very, very still, the particular stillness of someone absorbing an accusation that had actually managed to land somewhere real and painful. "I looked for you before I ever knew there was a baby," she said quietly, each word costing her something visible to say out loud. "I searched for 4 months, Myra, long before any ultrasound existed, long before any registry flag existed to justify the search to anyone who might have asked why their CEO was spending her weekends combing through club footage and rideshare records. I tore my own household apart trying to find the woman who left before I woke, because I could not stop thinking about you, because I had no name to search with. You never gave me one, and in my own panic that morning, I never thought to leave mine somewhere you couldn't so easily destroy it." I stood there, my accusation dissolving somewhere in my throat before I could finish it. "I did not come back for an heir," Serafina said. "I came back for you. The child growing inside you is not the reason I care about either of you. She is simply the reason fate finally gave me an excuse to find you again, after I had nearly given up believing I ever would, after months of my own staff quietly suggesting I let it go. I did not know what to do with that. I still don't, fully, even now, looking back on it. But I remember sitting down across from her that night, both of us on the same side of the enormous, too formal dining table for once instead of opposite ends of it. And for the first time since the clinic door opened, I let myself actually look at her. Not the alpha queen, not the headline, not the terrifying stranger from a rain-soaked club. Just a woman who had apparently spent 4 months searching an entire city for someone whose name she'd never even learned. Out of nothing more than stubborn, quiet hope. "What did you actually do?" I asked her eventually, unable to help my own curiosity. To search for me, I mean, there must have been hundreds of clubs in the city that night. "I started with the club itself," she admitted, a little sheepishly, an expression I had genuinely never seen on her face before that moment. "Security footage, though it told me very little beyond confirming you existed and weren't simply something I had imagined during an unusually vivid heat-adjacent haze. I had my staff cross-reference rideshare pickups near that block for the following month. I visited 3 different coffee shops in the surrounding neighborhood on the theory that you might live locally, ordering the same drink each time in the hope some barista might recognize a description." "That's deeply unhinged," I said, though I found I was smiling despite myself. "Also somehow the most romantic unhinged thing I've ever heard." "I am aware it does not reflect particularly well on my judgment," Serafina said. "I run a company that manages thousands of employees and $30 billion in assets with total composure, and I could not stop myself from personally visiting coffee shops on a hunch. I have never quite forgiven myself for how little control I apparently had over the matter." "Good," I said. "I don't think you should forgive yourself for that one." Something shifted in the space between us then, something that had nothing to do with danger or protection or bloodlines, and everything to do with the simple, unglamorous fact of 2 people slowly, cautiously choosing to trust each other with the truth. Part 10, Bonding and Trust. I chose, after that conversation, to stop treating the penthouse like a cage and start treating it, cautiously, like what it was slowly becoming instead. The first place in months I hadn't had to face my own fear entirely alone, at 3 a.m., with no one to call. The nursery filled in gradually, not with expensive excess for its own sake, but with things I actually chose myself, piece by piece, over careful weekend afternoons. A second-hand rocking chair I insisted on keeping despite Serafina's repeated, gentle protests that she could easily buy something newer and structurally sounder. I told her the chair had character. She told me it had a squeaky hinge that would wake the baby. We compromised by having someone oil the hinge quietly and keeping the chair exactly where I wanted it. Soft yellow paint on one wall, chosen specifically because it matched absolutely nothing else in that carefully monochrome penthouse. And Serafina, to her genuine credit, let it stay exactly as mismatched as I wanted it to be, even bringing home a small yellow lamp to match it without my asking. Jamie visited for the first time 3 weeks into my stay there, marching through the lobby security with the fierce, unbothered protectiveness of someone who had spent 4 months worrying without knowing exactly where I'd disappeared to, demanding answers before she'd even fully sat down on the couch. She took one long look at Serafina, the tailored coat, the effortless authority radiating off her even in her own living room, the sharp cheekbones apparently responsible for this entire predicament in the first place, and said, flatly, without a trace of intimidation in her voice, "So you're the wrong number with cheekbones." Serafina blinked, genuinely thrown, possibly for the first time since I'd met her. Yes, I suppose that is an accurate if unflattering summary of events." "Good," Jamie said, dropping onto the enormous couch like she'd owned it her whole life and had simply been away on vacation. "Someone clearly needs to keep this one from working through her own exhaustion out of sheer stubbornness. I approve, conditionally, pending further review of your behavior over the coming weeks, and I reserve the right to revoke that approval at any time." For the first time since the clinic door had first opened, the penthouse actually felt like it had room in it for ordinary laughter, for the specific, mundane comfort of old friends teasing new partners, for something that resembled a normal life instead of a crisis being carefully, expensively managed room by room. We settled, over the following weeks, into something that almost resembled routine. Mornings with ginger tea and quiet, unhurried conversation. Afternoons where Serafina worked from the penthouse office rather than her downtown headquarters, close enough that I could hear the low murmur of her voice through the wall on calls, oddly comforting rather than intrusive, a reminder that I wasn't alone in the apartment even when we weren't in the same room. Evenings where we argued, gently and without any real heat behind it, about names. She favored something classical and dignified. I favored something that didn't sound like it belonged on a corporate letterhead someday. And we compromised, eventually, on something that satisfied neither of our first choices completely and both of us anyway. One Saturday, Serafina insisted on cooking dinner herself, waving off the household staff for the evening with the specific stubbornness of someone attempting to prove a point she hadn't been asked to prove. The results were, to put it kindly, ambitious rather than successful, a sauce reduced past the point of recovery, rice that had somehow burned on the bottom while staying undercooked on top, an oven timer that had apparently been set in a unit of time that did not exist. "This is inedible," I told her, poking at the char on my plate with the specific delight of someone who had, for once, caught the most competent person she knew failing at something completely. "It is a learning process," Serafina said, with the wounded dignity of a woman who ran a multinational company and had never once, in her adult life, needed to personally cook a meal for anyone. "I am told practice improves outcomes. Please practice somewhere that isn't my dinner." We ordered takeout instead, sitting on the kitchen floor because the dining table felt, that night, too formal for the specific ridiculousness of the evening. And it became, without either of us planning it, one of my favorite memories of that entire strange, transitional year. Not the grand gestures, not the boardroom declarations, but a billionaire alpha sitting cross-legged on marble tile, defending her burnt rice with genuine indignation, while I laughed harder than I had in months. Jamie, informed of this story later by phone, declared it the most humanizing thing I have ever heard about a woman who owns half the skyline, and insisted on being present for the next cooking attempt, which went marginally better and produced, eventually, an actually edible pasta dish that Serafina refused to let anyone forget she had made herself. Part 11, The Public Attack. The Vale Family Council convened 2 weeks later, in a boardroom I had never once expected to set foot in, let alone be summoned to as the subject of its entire agenda. Dorian Vale arrived with the particular smugness of a man who believed, with total confidence, that he had already won before the meeting had even properly begun. "The registry confirms an unsanctioned pregnancy carrying Vale bloodline markers," Dorian announced to the assembled council, sliding a thick document across the polished table with theatrical precision, clearly enjoying every second of the performance he'd rehearsed. "This custody agreement ensures the child is raised within an appropriate family structure, regardless of the mother's circumstances, shall we say." "Say what you actually mean, Dorian," Serafina said, her voice dangerously, deliberately calm in a way that made several council members visibly shift in their seats, papers rustling nervously. "I mean," Dorian said, smiling thinly, clearly relishing the moment, "that an unemployed Omega with no family standing and no relevant assets has no meaningful legal claim to raise an heir to this family's legacy. It is simply not how things are done in families like ours, and everyone at this table knows it, whatever politeness demands we pretend otherwise." I felt every eye at that long table turn toward me, weighing me, cataloging me, finding me insufficient before I had even spoken a single word in my own defense. I had faced hostile rooms before in my life, difficult managers, unsympathetic landlords, a family that had not exactly celebrated the news of my pregnancy when I'd first told them, but never one deciding, in real time, with legal documents already drafted and printed, whether my daughter belonged to me or to a bloodline chart on a wall somewhere in this building. I looked at Serafina, and for the first time since the night I had run from her in the rain, I saw something in her expression that had absolutely nothing to do with power or control or composure at all. For the first time, I saw the alpha queen look more afraid of losing me than losing her throne. Dorian continued, apparently emboldened by the silence around the table, pulling a second document from his folder with the air of a man delivering a killing blow. We have also compiled testimony suggesting Miss Chen's financial circumstances prior to this pregnancy raise legitimate questions about motive. An Omega with significant debt, no stable housing at the time of conception, suddenly pregnant by one of the wealthiest women in the country. The board would be derelict not to examine whether this pregnancy was, shall we say, strategically pursued. The accusation landed like a slap, worse somehow than the custody threat itself, because it reached backward into that rain-soaked night and tried to recast it as a calculation rather than the reckless, unplanned collision it had actually been. "I did not know her name," I said, before I could stop myself, my voice shaking but audible across the entire room. "I destroyed the only piece of paper that would have told me who she was. I ran from her the next morning specifically because I did not want anything from a woman I assumed only wanted me for a single night. If you would like to examine motive, Mr. Vale, I would suggest examining your own, since you are the one currently trying to legislate a baby into a corporate asset." A murmur moved through the room, something that might almost have been approval from a few of the more skeptical council members, and I caught Seraphina's eyes across the table. Something fierce and proud flickering there beneath the controlled fury she was holding in check for the moment. Part 12, the Queen's Declaration. Seraphina stood. She did not raise her voice. She never needed to. The room fell silent around her the way rooms had apparently always fallen silent around her presence, built over years of careful, feared authority that had never once needed to shout in order to be obeyed instantly. She picked up Dorian's custody contract, read it once, fully, in complete silence, while the entire council watched and waited, the tension in the room stretching thin enough to feel physical. Then, without any theatrical flourish at all, she tore it cleanly in half, and then in quarters, and set the pieces down on the polished table with a precision far more devastating than any raised voice could ever have managed. "This child is not an heir first," Seraphina said, her voice carrying to every corner of that vast room without effort. "She is a baby, and Myra is not a vessel for this family's bloodline to pass through unacknowledged and unappreciated. She is the woman I choose publicly in front of every single one of you, regardless of what any registry believes it has the authority to decide about either of them without my consent." Dorian opened his mouth to object, already reaching for some fallback argument he'd clearly prepared, and Seraphina's gaze cut across the table and silenced him before he could find the words to use it. "Myra is not carrying my heir," Seraphina said, to the entire room, each word landing with the full weight of everything she had built over 20 years of earning that particular authority. "She is carrying our child. Learn the difference before I am forced to teach it to you myself, and I promise you, Dorian, you will not enjoy that particular lesson, nor will your position on this council survive it." No one in that room said another word for a long, heavy moment. Dorian's custody claim did not survive the meeting. Neither, as far as I could later tell from the quiet, satisfied whispers among the staff afterward, did his standing with the rest of the council in any meaningful sense going forward. I did not fully understand, until we were back in the car afterward, my hand still shaking slightly in my lap, exactly how much that declaration had cost her, not financially, but personally, publicly staking her own reputation and family, standing on a woman the entire family had spent the meeting trying to dismiss as insufficient, unworthy, temporary. "Thank you," I said quietly once we were alone. "Do not thank me for telling the truth," Seraphina said, and reached over to take my hand without another word, holding it the entire ride home. The fallout in the weeks that followed moved faster than either of us expected. 2 council members who had sided quietly with Dorian resigned within the month, apparently unwilling to continue association with a man whose reputation had taken a very public, very permanent hit. Dorian himself made one more attempt, a leaked story to a tabloid, painting me as a gold-digging opportunist who had trapped one of the country's most powerful alphas. But the story collapsed within days once actual journalists bothered to check the timeline and discovered that Serafina had demonstrably been searching for me for months before any pregnancy existed at all, a detail that made the entire manufactured narrative fall apart under its own weight. I almost feel sorry for him, I admitted one evening, watching the news cycle move on to something else entirely, Dorian's name already fading from relevance. Almost, Serafina agreed, not looking up from her book, is doing a great deal of work in that sentence. I laughed and let it go, and found, to my own mild surprise, that I genuinely did not think about Dorian Vale again for a very long time after that. Part 13, The Birth. The baby came 3 weeks early, on a night neither of us had fully prepared for despite months of careful preparation. My water breaking at 2 in the morning with the specific inconvenient drama that babies, apparently, specialize in delivering regardless of anyone's careful planning. Serafina drove faster than any legal speed limit reasonably allowed, and did not apologize for it once, her jaw set, her eyes flicking constantly between the road and me in the passenger seat, one hand never fully leaving mine, even while she navigated the empty pre-dawn streets with a focus I imagine she usually reserved for billion-dollar negotiations. She held my hand through every single contraction, through every long, exhausting hour of labor that followed, through the moment I told her, not entirely fairly, but with the specific brutal honesty labor apparently grants a person, that I hated her for putting me through this, even though logic clearly indicated the biology involved was not remotely her fault alone. "That's fair," she said, each time I said it, never once arguing back, simply pressing a cool cloth to my forehead and letting me be as unreasonable as I needed to be. Somewhere around hour 6, when the pain crested to a point I hadn't known existed, I gripped her hand hard enough to leave marks and told her, through gritted teeth, that if she ever suggested a second child, I would personally have her removed from the company she owned. She laughed, actually laughed, at the worst possible moment, and somehow that laugh steadied me more than any calm words could have. "Noted," she said, struck from all future planning documents. "I'm serious, Serafina." "I know you are. I am taking it very seriously. Breathe, Myra, you're almost there. The nurse says you're almost there." She held on through all of it, through the nurse's calm instructions and the sudden urgency near the end, when the monitors beeped in a rhythm that made every staff member in the room move faster and Serafina's grip on my hand turned briefly, unmistakably afraid before she caught herself, and steadied it again for my sake. She held on until the room finally filled with a sound neither of us had ever heard before, and would never, for the rest of our lives, forget. The first time our daughter cried, Serafina Vale cried harder. I watched the Alpha Queen, feared across an entire industry, composed through every crisis this family had ever thrown at her over decades of practice managing exactly this kind of pressure, come completely, beautifully undone at the sound of a newborn's first breath, her hand still locked tightly around mine, tears she made absolutely no effort at all to hide this time, not even a token attempt at the composure she'd spent a lifetime perfecting. "She's here," Serafina kept saying, over and over quietly, like she needed to repeat it enough times to fully believe it herself. "She's actually here. She's real. I keep thinking I'll wake up and she won't be, and then I look at her again." "You sent me an ultrasound by accident," she said to me later, once the nurses had finally given us a few private minutes with our daughter settled quietly between us, wrapped in a hospital blanket neither of us had chosen, but both of us would keep forever anyway. "But you gave me a family by choice. I want you to know I understand the difference, and I will spend the rest of my life being grateful for it, however long that turns out to be." Jamie arrived at the hospital within the hour, somehow already carrying a ridiculous stuffed animal she must have bought at the gift shop downstairs, and burst into the recovery room with considerably less decorum than the situation probably called for. She took one look at the baby, then at Serafina's still blotchy, tear-streaked face, then at me, exhausted and hollowed out and happier than I had ever been in my entire life. "Okay," Jamie said, wiping her own eyes without any apparent embarrassment about it. "Okay, this is a lot. Someone give me a job. What do you need? I will fight a nurse if that's what this requires." No one needs you to fight a nurse, I said, laughing despite the exhaustion dragging at every part of my body. I'm just saying I'm prepared to, Jamie said, settling into the chair beside the bed like she intended to stay for the duration, which, as it turned out, she did, falling asleep upright sometime around 4 a.m., still holding the ridiculous stuffed animal, while Serafina and I took turns simply staring at the small, impossible person we had somehow made between us out of a rainy night, and a wrong number and 4 months of running that had, in the end, led exactly here. Part 14. Home. The penthouse, in the weeks that followed, stopped feeling like a cage of any kind entirely. The nursery filled with the ordinary, beautiful chaos of a home with a newborn in it. Soft toys scattered across a floor that had once been immaculate. Bottles drying in a neat row by the kitchen sink. The specific, exhausted tenderness of two new parents slowly learning a language neither of us had spoken fluently before this. Serafina, who had once controlled every single variable in every room she entered, learned instead to sit motionless for hours at a time with our daughter asleep against her chest, refusing to move even when her arm went entirely numb beneath the weight, because she would not risk waking her for something as trivial as her own comfort. I no longer saw a golden cage when I looked around that apartment each morning. I saw the yellow paint I'd insisted on, mismatched and stubborn against the rest of the decor. I saw the second-hand rocking chair holding its own, squeaky hinge quietly oiled, against a room full of furniture worth more than my old apartment building combined. I saw, framed carefully on the nursery wall between two windows, the single grainy photograph that had started this entire impossible, improbable story between two people who never should have found each other again. The ultrasound I sent by mistake was framed on the nursery wall. Jamie visited constantly, appointing herself, without asking anyone's permission, official godmother and unofficial quality control for Serafina's continued behavior, showing up with takeout and unsolicited opinions in equal measure. My own family, once they saw the way Serafina held their granddaughter, slowly, cautiously began finding their way back into my life too, in the careful, imperfect way families sometimes do after disappointment gives way, eventually, to grandchildren, and the softening they bring with them. We were not, by any measure, a conventional family, but we were, unmistakably, a family, one built out of a wrong number, a rain-soaked night, 4 months of running, and a woman who had refused, from the very first moment she read 3 words on a stolen phone number, to let either of us disappear from her life again. There was an evening, a few months after the birth, when my mother visited for the first time since the whole complicated saga had begun. A visit that had been delayed by pride on both sides, mine and hers, and by the specific awkwardness of explaining a pregnancy that had started with a stranger and ended with a billionaire. She stood in the doorway of the nursery for a long moment, watching Serafina change a diaper with the same intense focus she apparently brought to merger negotiations, muttering something under her breath about incorrect fold technique that made me laugh out loud. "She's very serious about this," my mother said quietly to me in the hallway. "She's serious about everything," I said. "It's a little exhausting. It's also the reason none of us are currently dead or homeless, so I try not to complain too loudly." My mother watched a moment longer, watched Serafina lift the baby with the particular careful confidence that had taken months of practice to earn, watched her murmur something too quiet to hear against the top of our daughter's head. "I like her," my mother said finally, with the specific reluctant approval that meant more, coming from her, than an outright declaration would have from almost anyone else. "I didn't expect to, but I like her." It wasn't a grand reconciliation. It wasn't a Hallmark moment with swelling music. It was just two women slowly, carefully deciding that the family in front of them was worth showing up for, however unconventional its beginning had been. And for me, standing in that hallway, it was more than enough. Dr. Alian's practice, at our 6-week postpartum checkup, noted with clinical understatement that our daughter was thriving beyond typical expectations. A phrase Serafina had printed out and pinned to the refrigerator with the same seriousness she once reserved for quarterly earnings reports. Milo, Serafina's long-suffering assistant, had taken to sending baby-appropriate meeting reschedules with subject lines like, CEO unavailable, infant has priority clearance, which I suspected delighted Serafina more than she would ever admit aloud. Even the security detail, once a source of quiet resentment for me, had become something closer to extended family. The same two guards who'd first trailed me through grocery store aisles now argued cheerfully over who got to hold the baby during quiet afternoons, and one of them had, without any instruction from anyone, started keeping a small stash of teething toys in his jacket pocket. The penthouse's smart home system, once a symbol of everything sterile and controlled about that first golden cage, now mostly existed to play a specific rotation of lullabies at exactly the right volume for afternoon naps, a setting Serafina had programmed herself after 3 failed attempts at getting the temperature and lighting exactly right. The nursery baby monitor sat, absurdly, beside a stack of quarterly financial reports on the office desk, the two objects coexisting in a way that would have seemed impossible to me a year earlier, back when I still thought power and softness were mutually exclusive qualities in the same person. Even Camille, no relation to this particular family's Dorian, but a term Jamie insisted on using anyway for any future antagonist who might eventually show up, a running joke that had outlived its own logic entirely, became shorthand between us for any minor domestic disaster. The way, remember the burnt rice, had become shorthand for humility. The way, the wrong number, had become shorthand, eventually, for the single luckiest mistake either of us had ever made. I still worked eventually, when I felt ready not out of financial necessity anymore, but because Serafina had been clear, from very early on, that she never wanted me to feel my only value in that penthouse was as someone's mother or someone's partner. "You are allowed to want things for yourself," she told me once, simply, when I confessed I missed the small, specific satisfaction of solving a difficult spreadsheet problem. I took a position, eventually, consulting for a small nonprofit that helped pregnant workers navigate exactly the kind of precarious employment situation I'd once been trapped in myself. And Serafina attended my first public presentation with the same rapt, undivided attention she'd once given an ultrasound screen. Part 15, ending. I sent her the wrong picture. She found the right family. Maybe I never sent that ultrasound to the wrong number at all. Not really. Maybe, for once in my chronically unlucky, chronically broke, chronically exhausted life, my terrible luck actually knew exactly where to send me, better than I ever could have chosen for myself if I'd been given the option to choose deliberately. I think about that Tuesday often, the sick feeling at my desk, the shaking hands, the 3 cold words that answered a message meant for someone else entirely. I think about how easily I could have simply not sent it at all, could have waited until I got home, could have shown Jamie the photo over coffee the next morning the way I'd originally planned. 100 small variations of that day exist somewhere, in some other version of my life, and in almost none of them does a billionaire alpha ever learn my name at all. I don't know if I believe in fate, exactly. I balance my budget in color-coded spreadsheets. I am, by nature, a woman who prefers evidence to sentiment. But I know that somewhere between a rainy night I spent 4 months trying to forget, and an accidental text message I would have given anything to take back, something found its way to exactly where it needed to be, however little sense that makes on paper. I know that my daughter falls asleep every night to the sound of 2 people who would tear apart 100 custody contracts, break down 100 locked doors, drive through 100 red lights at 2 in the morning, just to make sure she never has to wonder whether she's wanted. That's the part I keep coming back to in the end. Not the wealth, not the danger, mostly resolved now, though never entirely absent. Just the fact that a wrong number turned into the first place I ever felt like I fully belonged. Sometimes, late at night, when I can't sleep, I find myself back at that kitchen counter from our first week together, the one where I found Serafina awake and listening for me in an apartment she wasn't yet used to sharing. It has become, without either of us planning it, our place for the hard conversations, the late confessions, the moments too big to fit anywhere else in the day. It was there she first told me she loved me, months after the birth, on an ordinary Wednesday with no particular occasion attached to it at all, simply because the words had finally arrived, and she saw no reason to wait for a more dramatic setting to say them. "I have been trying to find the correct moment for weeks," she admitted, looking faintly embarrassed by her own hesitation, an expression I had come to treasure precisely because it was so rare. "I kept waiting for something significant enough to deserve the words. I have since decided that is a foolish standard, and that an ordinary Wednesday is exactly the kind of day I would like this particular truth attached to." "I love you too," I told her, and meant it more completely than I had meant almost anything else in my entire life, standing in a kitchen I had once called a golden cage and now simply called home. For what it's worth, I've meant it since somewhere around the burnt rice. I think back sometimes to the version of myself sitting in that clinic waiting room, magazine unread in her lap, utterly convinced that the wrong number had made her life immeasurably more complicated and dangerous than it already was. I want to reach back through time and tell her it will be all right, that the danger is real but survivable, that the woman with the cold eyes and the tailored coat is not a threat to be managed, but a future worth running toward instead of away from. I know she wouldn't believe me. I'm not sure I would have believed me either, not then, not with a body already exhausted from being afraid for months on end. But I would tell her anyway, because some truths are worth saying even to people who can't yet hear them. I would tell her that the fear she is carrying is doing its job exactly as fear is supposed to, protecting her, keeping her cautious, making sure she doesn't hand her heart to someone who hasn't earned it. And I would tell her, too, that eventually, if she is patient, if she lets herself be found instead of running every time the ground feels unstable, someone is going to earn it completely, without ever once making her feel smaller for needing time to believe it. "That is deeply unflattering timing," she said, though she was smiling when she said it, the particular smile she reserved only for me and now for our daughter, and for absolutely no one else in the entire world. Late one evening, many months after the birth, with our daughter finally, blessedly asleep, and the penthouse quiet around us for the first time in what felt like days, an unknown number lit up Serafina's phone on the kitchen counter. A single message, no name attached, no explanation offered, no context at all beyond the words themselves, sitting there in the dark like a held breath. "Congratulations on the air. Now bring her home." Serafina's expression went carefully, dangerously still. The exact stillness I had learned, over the past year, meant she was containing something far larger than her face was currently showing. "Myra," she said quietly, setting the phone face down on the counter with deliberate control, "I think this story isn't finished yet.